The ocean air at the cliffside estate was thick with the scent of expensive jasmine and salt, a combination that usually felt like luxury, but tonight felt like a shroud. I stood on the marble terrace of the Vanderbilt mansion, my hand tracing the rim of a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne that cost more than my mother's monthly rent. Beside me stood Julian, the man the world saw as a visionary CEO, a pillar of the community, and the perfect partner. To everyone else, we were the gold standard of a modern relationship, a couple carved out of ivory and success. But as the moonlight hit the waves crashing hundreds of feet below the cliff's edge, I felt a familiar, cold shiver. I did not know then that by the end of this toast, my marriage would be reduced to ash in front of the city's most powerful elite. The occasion was our annual charity gala, an event where the air was heavy with the clinking of silverware and the hushed whispers of millionaires. Julian was in his element, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like a claim of ownership. When the music died down for the evening toasts, the silence was absolute. Julian raised his glass, his smile practiced and blinding, radiating the confidence of a man who owned everything he looked at. In a moment of rare, quiet courage, during a lull in the conversation with our neighbors, the Montgomerys, I mentioned it. It was a small seed I had been nurturing in secret for months. I told them, with a soft smile, that I had officially applied for a business management degree at the university. I expected a nod, perhaps a polite question. Instead, the air in the room seemed to vanish. I felt Julian's hand tighten on my waist until it bruised. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a terrifying purple rage that moved like a storm front across his features. The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of a toast, it was the suffocating stillness before a predatory strike. Then, the explosion happened. My husband did not whisper his disapproval. He did not wait for the privacy of our car. He screamed. The sound was visceral, a raw, guttural roar that shattered the refined atmosphere of the gala. He turned on me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and began to berate me with a ferocity that made my knees tremble. He shouted about my ingratitude, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. He called me selfish, a parasite who wanted to waste the money he bled for on a useless whim. He told the entire room that I was abandoning my duties in my marriage, that I was a failure as a wife for even thinking about a life outside of his shadow. Every word was a serrated blade, cutting through my dignity until I felt stripped bare in my $5,000 gown. I looked around the room, desperate for a single pair of eyes to meet mine, for a hand to reach out and stop the slaughter. But what I saw was the true face of the society we had built. The Montgomerys, who had eaten dinner at our table every Sunday for 3 years, suddenly found the bubbles in their champagne absolutely fascinating. The mayor turned his back to inspect a painting he had already seen a dozen times. The laughter of the crowd did not stop. It just transformed into a low buzzing hum of collective avoidance. They all looked the other way. My neighbors, my friends, the people who called me sister, they chose their social comfort over my public humiliation. The isolation was absolute. In that moment, I realized that my relationship was not a partnership. It was a cage, and the bars were made of the silence of everyone I knew. Julian leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear, his voice now a low, venomous hiss that only I could hear clearly, though the room was still watching our silhouettes. He told me I was nothing without his name, that I was a decorative piece of furniture he had bought and paid for. I stood there, paralyzed, feeling smaller than the dust on the floor. I watched as the people I thought loved me retreated into the shadows of the estate, leaving me alone in the blinding spotlight of my husband's wrath. It was a social betrayal so profound, it felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. But as I stood on that cliffside, listening to the man I had promised my life to tear it apart for sport, I noticed something. Julian was not just angry. He was panicked. There was a frantic edge to his insults, a desperation in the way he tried to keep me under his thumb. Underneath the diamonds and the silk and the roaring ocean, I realized that the gilded deception of our life was beginning to crack. I looked at the dark water below and felt a strange, cold clarity. This was not the end of my story. It was the moment the mask fell off. Little did I know, The screaming was just a distraction from a much darker truth. Within 48 hours, I would discover that my husband was not just a bully, he was a thief, a liar, and a man who was already planning the date of my funeral. This Reddit relationship story began with a scream, but I was determined to make sure it ended with the truth. As Marcus, his best friend, stepped forward from the shadows of the terrace, I saw a look in his eyes that I had never seen before. A look of profound, weary pity. He did not look at Julian. He looked at me. And in his hand, he gripped an encrypted drive as if it were a weapon. The night was cold, the guests were gone, and the real nightmare was only just beginning. I realized then that the man I slept next to every night was a stranger, and the life I thought I was living was a beautifully orchestrated lie. I breathed in the salt air one last time as Elena, the submissive wife, and prepared to become the woman who would burn his empire to the ground. In this world of high stakes and higher crimes, I was about to learn that trust is a luxury I could no longer afford. My husband had just started a war he was not prepared to win. The silence that followed Julian's last insult was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the very oxygen from the terrace. I stood there, my vision blurring at the edges, my soul retreating into a cold, dark corner of my mind where the pain could not reach it. But then, the pressure snapped. Marcus, the man who had stood at Julian's side during our wedding, the man who had been the architect of our social circle, stepped out of the periphery. He did not yell. He did not need to. His voice was a calm, steady blade that sliced through Julian's hysteria. He placed a hand on my husband's shoulder, a gesture that looked like support but felt like an arrest. Julian spun around, his teeth bared, ready to sink them into his oldest friend. "Stay out of this, Marcus," he spat, his ego blinded by his own noise. But Marcus did not flinch. His eyes, usually warm and professional, were now as hard as flint. "I cannot stay out of it, Julian, because I have seen the shadows you think you have hidden so well," he said. The crowd, previously statues of indifference, leaned in as one. The air grew frigid. "You want to talk about abandonment?" Marcus asked, his voice rising just enough to carry to the furthest corners of the estate. "Then let us talk about the $89,000 you siphoned from the employee pension fund over the last 12 months. Let us talk about the apartment on the waterfront, the one with the silk sheets and the view you told your wife was a business investment." Julian went from purple to a ghostly, hollow white in the span of a single heartbeat. The predator was suddenly the prey. Marcus turned his gaze to the crowd, his words a final devastating blow. "This man is not a pillar of anything. He is a cheating husband who has spent nearly $100,000 of stolen money to fund an affair with his assistant, Serafina." The word affair hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Serafina. The name was a ghost I had seen in the margins of his emails, a face I had been told belonged to a dedicated employee. The betrayal was not a single stab in the back. It was 1,000 tiny cuts that finally bled me dry. I looked at Julian and saw not a powerful man, but a crumbling ruin of lies. His hands began to shake, his mouth working but producing no sound. The socialites who had looked away from my humiliation now stared at him with a predatory hunger, their judgment swift and merciless. In the chaos of whispers and gasps, Marcus moved toward me. He leaned in, his shadow shielding me from the vultures, and pressed something small and cold into my palm. It was a silver drive, heavy with the weight of the truth. "Everything is on here, Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling with a grief I did not yet understand. The accounts, the messages, the receipts. Do not let him win. I looked down at the drive, the key to my cage. I felt a surge of something I had forgotten existed. Power. This was the end of the gilded deception. As I turned to leave the terrace, Julian reached for me, a desperate, pathetic grab for the life he had just incinerated. I did not look back. I walked away from the lights, the champagne, and the monster I had called my husband, clutching the proof of his betrayal against my chest like a heartbeat. The night was still dark, but for the first time in years, I could see the path forward. I was no longer a victim waiting for a miracle. I was a woman with a weapon, and I was going to make sure Julian lost everything he had ever stolen from me. I sat in the hollow silence of my study, the glowing screen of my laptop the only source of light in a house that now felt like a mausoleum. The silver drive Marcus had given me felt heavy, a cold piece of metal that held the power to either set me free or bury me alive. As I clicked through the first few folders, the sheer scale of the husband infidelity began to take shape, but it was far more monstrous than a simple affair. I expected more receipts for Serafina's apartment or jewelry for her neck, but instead, I found a labyrinth of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. My breath hitched as I watched the numbers climb. This was not just a cheating husband hiding a girlfriend. This was a systematic, ruthless money laundering scheme. Julian had siphoned $1.2 million from the company, bleeding his partners and his employees dry to feed a secret empire I never knew existed. Each document was a testament to his greed, a digital trail of betrayal that turned my stomach. But the rabbit hole went deeper, into a darkness I was not prepared to face. I found a hidden directory labeled with a series of random characters. Inside were PDF files that made my blood turn to ice. They were life insurance policies. 3 of them. Each one was taken out in my name over the last 8 months, totaling $5 million. My eyes locked onto the signatures at the bottom of the pages. They were perfect. They looked exactly like my own handwriting, every curve and slant meticulously mimicked. Julian had forged my signature on documents that placed a massive price tag on my head. I was no longer a wife to him. I was an asset to be liquidated. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I realized the true extent of the broken trust between us. He did not just want to leave me for Serafina. He wanted me dead. Then I found the messages. They were encrypted, but the drive had the keys to unlock them. The correspondence was with a user named The Mechanic. The tone was chillingly professional, as if they were discussing a plumbing repair rather than a human life. Julian had provided maps of the cliffside trails we were supposed to hike next weekend for our anniversary. The mechanic had responded with details about brake lines, carbon monoxide, and finally, the preferred method, a tragic hiking accident at the cliff's edge. One text from Julian read, "Make it look clean, no room for questions. I want this finished by Monday." I felt a wave of nausea so powerful I had to grip the edge of the desk to stay upright. My husband, the man I had loved for a decade, was negotiating the cost of my murder. The betrayal was absolute, a jagged glass shard driven into my soul. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage was a lie. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to call Marcus. I needed to hear a friendly voice, someone who could tell me this was a nightmare. But the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and then a third time. Nothing. I drove to his apartment in a state of blind panic, only to find the door unlocked and the room stripped bare. Marcus was gone. No clothes, no laptop, no sign that he had ever lived there. On the kitchen counter sat a single scrap of paper with 5 words that shattered what little remained of my world. Do not trust the local police. I stood alone in the empty apartment, the weight of the $5 million bounty on my head pressing down on me. Julian owned the company, he owned the town, and now I realized he likely owned the law as well. I was a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, with no one left to trust, and a husband who was waiting for me to fall. The air inside the sterile FBI safe house was cold, but it was nothing so freezing as the ice in my veins when Agent Sterling revealed the truth about Detective Miller. Hearing that the man I had trusted with my life was on Julian's payroll felt like a fresh wound in an already broken heart. This betrayal was not just personal, it was systemic. Every word I had whispered to Miller in confidence, every tear I had shed in his office had been sold back to my husband for a price. Sterling looked at me with a grim focus, telling me that the only way to ensure a total divorce and a conviction that would actually hold was to draw the monster out of his lair. But before we could plan, the enemy struck again. A man calling himself Agent Vance lured me to a deserted shipyard on the east side of the city. I arrived at 3 p.m, the sky gray and oppressive. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and broken dreams. When I saw the glint of steel in the hand of the man approaching my car, my survival instinct ignited. I did not scream. I did not freeze. I threw the car into reverse, the engine roaring like a wounded beast. I narrowly escaped the trap, the realization of how high the corruption went finally settling in my bones. I met Sterling back at a secure location, my hands still shaking but my heart hardening into a diamond. I told her I would do it. I would act as the bait. We chose a remote mountain cabin, a place that screamed vulnerability. It was the ultimate risk, a gamble with my very existence. I spent 48 hours in that cabin, listening to the creaking of the floorboards and the howling of the wind. I was a woman waiting for her own executioner. On the second night, at exactly 2:45 in the morning, the power died. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of death. I heard the careful, rhythmic breathing of a professional. The mechanic had arrived. Through the floorboards, I heard the metallic clink of tools. He was sabotaging the gas lines, preparing to turn the cabin into a tomb while I supposedly slept. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I sat in the darkness, clutching my phone, the only link to the team hidden in the woods. Suddenly, the night shattered. Sterling and a dozen tactical agents swarmed the cabin with the precision of a lightning strike. The high-tension takedown was a symphony of chaos. I watched from the stairs as the mechanic was slammed against the wall, his weapon clattering to the floor. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and victory. As the agents led him away in chains, I felt the first true breath of freedom in years. The betrayal that had once paralyzed me was the fuel for my resurrection. I was no longer the victim of this Reddit relationship story. I was the architect of my own justice. I stood on the porch, looking out at the dark mountain peaks, and I knew that Julian was next. He had tried to silence me, to bury me in a mountain of forged papers and gas fumes, but he had only succeeded in creating his own worst nightmare. The divorce was no longer just about splitting assets, it was about eviscerating the man who thought he could own my life. I was ready for the final confrontation. I was ready to take back my name and my soul from the wreckage he had made of our marriage. For the first time, I was not afraid of the dark. I was the one walking through it. The mahogany paneling of the courtroom felt like the walls of a sanctuary as I watched Julian stand to receive his fate. The arrogance that had once defined his every movement was gone, replaced by a hollow, twitching desperation that made him look like a stranger. When the judge spoke the words 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for at least 20, the sound felt like the final hammer blow on the coffin of my marriage. I did not feel the surge of joy I expected. Instead, I felt a profound, quiet peace. The divorce was finalized an hour later, the judge awarding me the totality of the stolen assets as restitution for the emotional and financial wreckage Julian had left in his wake. As I signed the final papers, the ink felt like a seal on a past life, a formal end to the broken trust that had nearly cost me my existence. I walked out of that building a wealthy woman, but for the first time, the money did not feel like a gilded cage. It felt like a foundation. For months, I lived in a state of quiet rebuilding, focusing on the relationship I had neglected for a decade, the one with myself. Then, on a rainy afternoon, when the mist clung to the cliffs like a memory, Marcus returned. He did not come with fanfare or excuses. He found me at a small cafe near the water and sat across from me, his eyes heavy with a truth he had carried for 8 long years. He told me he had loved me since before the day I walked down the aisle to Julian. He confessed that his silence was born of a paralyzing fear that I would never believe him, that I would see his warnings as the jealous ramblings of a man trying to sabotage my happiness. He had spent years documenting Julian's crimes in the shadows, waiting for the moment he could save me without losing me. Our romance began not with a spark, but with a slow, agonizingly honest conversation. We built our new life on the ashes of the old one, choosing a path of radical transparency to heal the scars of betrayal. It was the first time I had ever felt truly seen, truly safe, and truly loved for who I was, not what I represented. But justice, I learned, is rarely as simple as a prison sentence. A year into our new life, as we sat in the quiet of our living room, Marcus handed me a final file he had kept hidden even from the FBI. His face was pale, his voice a mere whisper that chilled the air. He told me that as he dug deeper into the offshore accounts to help the authorities close the case, he found a terrifying discrepancy. Julian was a thief and a bully, But he was not a genius. The $1.2 million and the complex shell companies were not his creation. Julian was merely the face, a useful idiot for a much larger entity. Marcus revealed that the money trail did not end in the Cayman Islands. It flowed back into a domestic account belonging to a shadow corporation with ties to people much more powerful than a disgraced CEO. Someone else had authorized the mechanic. Someone else had forged the life insurance policies and paid off the local police. Julian was a pawn who had been sacrificed to protect a king I could not see. As I looked out the window at the dark tree line, I realized that the unseen shadow was still out there, watching and waiting. My husband was behind bars, but the mastermind who had orchestrated the collapse of my marriage was still free. I realized then that while I had won the battle, the war for my safety might never truly be over. This Reddit relationship story did not end with a white picket fence. It ended with a haunting question that keeps me awake at night. Am I truly safe, or am I just waiting for the shadow to move again? I reached for Marcus's hand, finding strength in the only truth I had left, knowing that whatever comes from the darkness, I will no longer be its victim. I am a survivor, and I am finally ready to fight back.